Hunter, with some help from Jack, made up a cart that he could hook Moxy up to. Really, it was just a couple of wheels on an axle with seats connected to it and connecting arms to a harness that Hunter had found on the internet. It was a lot of fun to go for a ride in, though. Even Smith had a grin on his face. While Smith was being transported around the back paddock, he thought, those boys really need their licenses, so he had to talk to them about it. It turned out BP knew where a car was for free. The boys just had to get it out. It was stuck in a paddock. Hunter hitched Moxy up to the car with some ropes from the harness to the car, and he pulled that car straight out of the boggy ground as soon as the brakes were let off. Probably just about would have skidded it out even with the brakes on. When BP was free, he put his A-frame onto his ute and towed the old car to the Gunters. Jack spent a bit of time under the bonnet, and soon that car was running. The next day, Hunter had a job to do. He had to go up to the Glockies to set traps. The gardener had seen rats, and the back of the Gunter farm met up with the road around the hill. That was one of the reasons Maguire had originally wanted the Joe Gunter's farm. A subdivision there was worth a fortune connecting with that other road, and it only needed a change in town planning, and Maguire could make that happen easily. Hunter saddled up Moxy and headed up there. He had his new leather bag. It was working so well. He already had a few traps stored up at the Glockies, and there was a jar of the rat's favourite paste in his bag. There was a gate in the far paddock, nearly opposite the Glockies' driveway. Hunter went through that and went up to the gate into the Glockies' place. It was a big, imposing gate with huge fences right the way around the whole property. You couldn't see into it, but there was a push-button buzzer there, so he pushed it, and Glockie said, "Come in, Hunter, come in." And as the gate swung open, Hunter wondered where the camera and speakers were. He'd never been able to work that out. Glockie had probably made a speaker that looked like a rock. "Magnificent," the professor cried out as Hunter rode up to the house on Moxy. Marissa came out and took a photo. "Smith did tell me he was quite something else, and he wasn't wrong," Glockie exclaimed. Glockie and Smith, they were good friends. Glockie asked Hunter if he could come into the lab for a bit, and Hunter said, "Okay," with a hint of nervousness in his voice. With Glockie, things could escalate. A bit like a gunpowder volcano, but a gunpowder volcano on steroids. Glockie handed a small package to Hunter. It was a tube about 4 inches long, maybe about 40 millimeters diameter. There was an indentation to press, and when you pressed it, a brolly emerged. Glockie explained it was nearly indestructible. You could even use it as a parachute, reasoned Glockie. He wondered if Hunter could give it an extensive trial, pretty much to see if he could wreck it without deliberately trying to wreck it. Hunter took the brolly and put it into the small pocket on the back of Moxy's saddle. Molly was at school. Hunter went rat tracing. Sure enough, there were rat droppings and tracks. Hunter set a group of traps where they would only catch the rats and not any other wildlife or birds. He'd come back the next day to clear them. Then something unusual happened. Glockie came running, well, at as fast a clip as he could make anyway, across the lawn. He paused momentarily, turning, and called to the man rapidly coming up on him. "Go," he said, "don't be here." And Hunter wondered who that man was. Then he caught up to Hunter, and at that very instant, roaring up the driveway, there was a plethora of police and federal cars, sirens screaming. "Too late," Glockie said. "I hoped to warn you before they got up the driveway." The detective was back. Maybe his cushy posting had been too cushy. The cops all had drawn guns and approached them, screaming, "Get on the ground!" And they weren't going to argue with the cops with drawn guns. Glockie was slow getting onto the ground, and the detective shoved him. They were both handcuffed. The detective instructed the young constable, Eric, who was with him, to bring them up to the house. The federal cars discharged a team of boffins who began to go through the lab. Glocky demanded to know what was going on. The detective waved a warrant in front of him. "Anthrax, old man, looking for your stash." Glocky was dumbfounded. He had never made anthrax. He could have if he'd wanted to. Glocky could design and make anything. "What do we have here then?" said the detective once they were up at the lab. He took Hunter's bag off him and searched it. Now, there weren't any cameras in the lab, and they were over in the corner. The detective reached inside the bag and pulled out a tin-foil wrapped block package. Glocky turned slightly. He had seen the detective reach into his own pocket first and place a package into Hunter's bag. The boffins were talking to the detective, who came back over to where Eric was guarding Glocky and Hunter. They wanted the computers. The only one they had found was Marissa's. It had been packaged to take away. They'd filled some boxes with files from the lab, and the whole house was being searched. They're pretty much making a massive mess and pulling it apart and opening drawers and tipping them out. And in the lab, there was just terrible mess. Glocky told them to press a button concealed behind some books on a shelf. A section of the wall slid aside when they pressed it, and there was a room complete with servers and a supercomputer. This wasn't something they could take away. They wanted his passwords. Not likely, Glocky told them. The Maguire family had been in the county for a long time. In fact, for as long as the county had been a county, and even for a long time before that. Outwardly, it would appear these days that their wealth was from the law practice, construction, development, farming activities, and all of this was very true, and the ventures were profitable. Their real wealth, however, was linked to banking operations. Maguire, behind the scenes, owned banking in the state, and he sat on a secret advisory board to the central bank. I need to have a breath there. There was very little that got in the way of Henry Maguire's ambitions and plans, but just lately it seemed that the Gunter family and friends and acquaintances of the Gunters were becoming a real annoyance to Henry. More than that, a total hindrance. The more Henry thought about it, the more his resolve hardened. It was time to do something about it. It wouldn't be the first time tragedy befell someone in his way or went missing. He thought about the glue factory he'd relocated. The big meat grinders would be ideal to lose a body through. Bone, flesh, whatever, it ground the whole lot up to paste. The thought gave him pleasure. This was going to be clinical, pieces to remove from the chessboard, and it was time to begin. The first move was to check his records, the records of the sins of others, of which he had volumes. The plan appeared clear in his mind. First, that Glocky, bumbling fool interfering in his business. He knew that there were people high up in the state bureaucracy and military who were still angry at Glocky. Some years ago he'd invented a devastating weapon. But once the true destructive power of the weapon had become clear to him, he'd burnt it in all the plans. He'd had a demonstration with the military for the weapon, and the military, they wanted it. But Glocky had decided that it was just too dangerous, it was too bad, it was just too much destruction from it. And shortly after that, it was the first time that Glocky had had his lab raided. All the boffins hadn't been able to reverse engineer the weapon from the wreckage of it either. It had kind of basically eaten itself when he burnt it. Some sort of strange chemical reaction, but they hadn't been able to work it out. Now, one thing that Maguire had was a secure phone. It was fully encrypted. The phone call he made set up the delivery of an anthrax envelope from a secret state-funded lab going to a general's home address. It was the general who had wanted the weapon. The postcode was from a neighbouring county on the envelope. It was about a day's drive away, and there was a highway video of Glocky's Rolls Royce there in that county. It was the envelope that gave it away, though. There was an envelope reply to the invites for Henry's Save the Wetlands. His secretary, Maguire's secretary, dealt with all that stuff, but Maguire remembered walking through the office and seeing an unusual envelope. He'd looked at it and he remembered the Glocky name on it. He went back and he recovered the envelope. Now Maguire had an employee whose only job was to do whatever Maguire asked of him. Henry gave the envelope to him and said, "Find out about this." And it turned out that the envelope was from a custom stationery company, and that envelope was custom made and only available to Marissa Glocky, or Glocky. Now a quick break into that stationer's, and Maguire had the envelope that he needed, and he'd sent it to the people who loaded it with anthrax and sent it to the general. Of course it had didn't have Glocky's name on it, but now they had video of Glocky's car being in the area at the time, and it looked like an envelope that belonged to the Glockys. And once the call had come through the police system looking for information, and with a picture of the envelope, the police chief, who was in Maguire's pocket in his pay, he knew exactly what it was, and he'd been forewarned by Maguire to keep a lookout for that sort of envelope. And hence they'd turned up and were raiding the Glockies, and he sent his investigator, come dirty deed worker, to find out where that girl Molly had ended up. Maguire's foot still hurt really bad. The news that she was at the Glockies perplexed him, and he thought that Glocky must be a sentimental old fool. Still, she'd get caught up in that raid and at some stage go missing too. Henry thought long and hard about Smith. The idea he liked the most was a home invasion with shootings, and the place burnt down. He called his man and told him what he wanted. The crew that carried this out, he wanted removed after the event. Perhaps they should go through the meat grinder as well, so the less tracks it could find their way back to him, the better. He'd already made sure that BP wouldn't have any work from anyone who had a mortgage with any of his banks, or any banks that he had influence with, and so BP was not a preferred contractor, so to speak. Maguire began to feel a bit better. These things were immediate, and they would not be able to be traced back to him. Henry admired his team of horses being put through their paces from his office window. They would be ready for picnic day, and there would be no Smith or Glocky there. Reflecting, he thought about Glasgow. He knew the man was a friend of Smith's as well, and over the years, Glasgow had objected to plans for the waterfront that would change the working nature to a urban living place, just enough to be an irritation. A phone call established there was a loan against the business, not a large one, but a loan nonetheless. That loan was now going to be called in immediately. Another call to his man, and it was arranged that there would be a fire to the shipyard buildings. Maguire was feeling better minute by minute. His son Stan was slowly being assimilated into the family business, and next year he would start university, a law degree of course. Maguire made a mental note to have a word to Stan about curbing some of his excesses, or at least having those excesses where they wouldn't be noticed or reported on. One thing made him frown, that bloody horse. But then he smiled. When the Gunters were gone, so would the horse be gone. and it would go through the grinder as well. It was going to be all neat and tidy, like his farms with straight fences and even-sized paddocks, white pickets lining the driveways, trees and straight shelter belts neatly trimmed. He phoned his secretary and told her to book a table for two at his club that night. Give them plenty of time to get the champagne chilled. The club was discreet, perhaps more like secret. He would meet up with his mistress there. The police chief drove up the driveway to Glocky's. He was thinking if perhaps it was time to disappear. He had a plan. This anthrax was serious, and he was thinking Maguire was starting to go too far, perhaps a number of steps too far. Those envelopes with the cash in them, though, were very nice, and the amount in them was increasing. He drove such thoughts from his mind. Taking the professor into custody was going to be so sweet. He went in and saw the bonus. Hunter Joe Gunter. The detective showed the police chief the package that they'd found in Hunter's bag. Enough to charge him as a dealer, the detective told him. The chief told him good work. There was an opening for a new county in the county down the coast, and the chief had told the detective if he got Hunter into jail, it was his. He wasn't so happy about Glocky's refusal to provide passwords. Perhaps he'd crack under questioning. The boffins had had a look and said it was impossible to crack. The chief had Hunter and Glocky taken outside and put in a car. While the detective was doing that, he placed a small jar on the bench amongst a number of other chemicals. He didn't know what was in the jar. It looked empty. The jar's lid had a small embossed A on it. He'd supposed it was a manufacturer's mark. He cursed himself for not having a closer look. He'd have a word with Maguire about this. Getting him to carry a jar with anthrax around was a step too far, envelopes or not. Maguire's shadow investigator man had told him to be careful. The boffins had all left the room. There'd been a discovery of a hidden room behind the pantry. The chief had had a good, discreet look. There were no cameras in the lab. There were cameras outside the house that looked down the driveway and into the porch area. He went to look. A whole wall of the pantry swung open without a sound. The room was completely empty except for a device in the middle with a flashing LED light. You could tell that it wasn't a bomb. The device was open. If you looked away quickly, it appeared as if the whole device moved, but you couldn't be sure. None of the boffins had any idea what it was. The detective was back, and the chief told him to go and question Glocky about it. While the detective went to do this, the chief went through the door at the far end of the kitchen. It was probably the biggest kitchen he'd ever seen. Through the doors was a very small apartment, a small bedroom, a shower with a toilet, and a space for a couch that looked out over the garden. It was obviously a woman's room, the clothing and a bottle of perfume. He picked up a workbook. It said Molly Muffin. His interest picked up. He was still limping from that kick from a woman called Molly. He'd let that all go as Maguire had instructed. There was a photo album in a drawer. It was the same Molly. Now this was interesting. He had to gather his thoughts. He knew Maguire had said he was going to take care of it, that incident with her, but Glocky was the one she had left with. Whichever way he looked at it, she was connected to Glocky, and if Glocky was going down, she should go down. The detective was back. The chief wanted him to search the room. The detective told him Eric had already done that, and there was nothing of interest. The chief said, but not searched the room like a detective who discovered the package on Hunter. Who knows what he might find? With a nudge and a wink, the detective agreed that he should do so. First, though, he told the chief about the thing in the other room. Glocky told him it was beyond his understanding and to leave it alone. When the chief asked him if it was dangerous, he said very. The police chief looked at it again in the room and asked the boffin if he thought it was dangerous? And the answer was, not as far as we can tell. It looks like a transmitter of some sort. The chief told them to pack it up and take it away. Two of the boffins picked it up to put it in an open box when it vanished and reappeared on the other side of the room, glowing red hot, melting and humming. It was lucky no one had been standing there. They all left the room in a bit of a hurry, and none of them were comfortable with the thing. The cook and the gardener were sent home after an interview. The cook didn't know about the room at the back of his pantry. It was secret and hidden. The detective went back outside to his car, rummaged around in the boot, and then went back inside. He searched the small kitchen apartment and found another tinfoil package. It was hidden inside a leather jacket in the wardrobe. He called the young constable Eric in to witness it and do the paperwork. The detective was lazy, and any time he could get someone to do his work, he would. Eric said nothing, but he'd searched that room, and there had been nothing of criminal note. He'd even patted down the clothing and checked inside the shoes. Not that there was a lot of either. It was all recorded on his body cam. He said nothing. This was not the time. The boffins discovered the jar with an A, and it was suddenly all hazard suits and respirators and police tape and danger tape and all sorts of stuff. They left the mansion in a cavalcade of 3 vehicles, the chief, the detective, and a squad car with Hunter, Glocky, and his wife in it. Eric had been instructed to go and arrest Molly. The cars didn't travel back to the police station. They were travelling to a black site, off the books in the industrial area. It was an unofficial site the police chief maintained to deal with people outside of the system, sometimes to lock someone up for a few days to scare them, sometimes for the state's secretive services to use to hold someone. This was now a terrorism act, and as such they could be treated this way. What they didn't pick up on was the scooter that followed some distance behind them. Glocky's man, when instructed to leave, followed a carefully prearranged plan. There was a tunnel from the house to a shed close to the wall, out of sight from the main house. It was concealed in a group of trees. He knew they wouldn't find the tunnel entrances. They were extremely well hidden. When he came up in the shed full of bric-a-brac, he took a careful view around it. There was that kid's giant horse parked up right outside the little shed. He knew that even though it couldn't be seen at the moment, it only took one person to come over the rise for that to change. There was a section of the wall here that opened like a gate. He took the horse by the bridle, and with some trepidation, he led that horse through the gate. Directly opposite was the gate into the Gunter's. He put the horse into the paddock and went back into the shed. There was a computer in the shed behind a shelf, and it was hooked up to the lab. Just because the police chief and detective couldn't see any cameras inside the house didn't mean there weren't any there. The lab was filmed in every direction. In the rest of the house there weren't any cameras. The cameras were concealed and small and of very high quality, and they recorded sound as well. He watched what the detective did and said. He downloaded the file to a USB stick. He saw quite clearly the chief putting a jar amongst the other chemicals on the bench. The sound recording was high quality, and the chief could quite clearly be heard saying, "See how this works out for you, old man. Bye, bye, bye." He added that to the stick. When they were about to leave in the cars, he left the shed. There was a scooter that looked like a postie bike under a tarp, and he wheeled it through the gate and put on a high-vis jacket. He looked like a postal worker or courier driver. He drove down the road to hook up with them, but his timing was out. He'd wanted to follow them, but he was now in front. A few houses down he stopped and pretended to sort some mail for the letterbox, and the cavalcade rolled past. They weren't in a rush. After a few kilometres he could tell where they were going, to the industrial area. The road they were on could only go there. He took an alternative route and lost his high-vis jacket. A postie bike, you can take alternative route and get down narrow paths and things. And he looked a bit different with that high-vis jacket gone. When the roads rejoined, the cars were some distance ahead, and he saw them turn into a warehouse yard surrounded by high fences with barbed wire and electrified fences. Not that unusual around some of the industrial buildings. There was an auto-opening roller door, but he couldn't see inside. He rode around the block, but there was no back entrance. Just in view of the warehouse, there was an industrial area lunch bar cafe. He pulled in to get a coffee and a pie. He sat outside at a picnic table where he could see the warehouse. No cars left, but another arrived with a young woman in it. He couldn't be sure, but he thought it was Molly. He left.